Welcome to Comment with me, George Galloway, here on Press TV, which remains the voice of the voiceless. Comment is the big conversation, it's the great debate, but it can only be either of those if you join in. That's why, above all, I need your telephone calls. The number to call is 44-208-601-4555. You call us, we'll call you back. Establish a clear line, and remember, if you get on the television with me, the volume on your television has to be down at 0, or I'll have to press swiftly on because no one would understand either of us. You can also SMS the show on 447800008066, or you can email me at comment@presstv.co.uk, and you can even tweet the show at comment_Press TV. Now, who has been effective in fighting ISIL? They haven't done torturing, they haven't done murdering, they haven't done desecrating. Just this week, they burned to the ground an ancient Armenian Christian church which had been built to commemorate the genocide of Armenian people in 1915. Didn't even make it to its centenary. And in the church were the bones of many of the victims of the 1915 massacre. The ISIL fanatics threw the bones to the four winds, tossed them around like playthings. They destroyed the records in the church of the people who had perished in that Turkish genocide in 1915. Ironic, therefore, that ISIL, no doubt, crossed the border into Syria from the very same Turkey. Certainly were armed and resupplied endlessly through Turkey. And the government of Turkey certainly turned a blind eye, at least, and actively collaborated, at worst, in making ISIL the fighting force that it has become. The story was, a few days ago, that the leader, the self-appointed Caliph, Baghdadi, as he calls himself, though his name is Samurai, was dead in an American bombardment. That would appear to have been scotched today by the release of an audio tape in which Baghdadi calls on the faithful in Saudi Arabia, for example, to unsheath their swords, not to fight against the hypocrites that rule and loot the country of Saudi Arabia, no, to unleash their swords and stick them in Shiite Muslims, 20% of the population of Saudi Arabia. You really couldn't make this fellow up. Although maybe we did, and we'll come to that in the course of the next hour or so. I want to say something about the bombardment of ISIL. It's not serious. I was against it anyway, believing that it would make every matter worse. I don't support it. But what's happening now is not a real or genuine bombardment. I don't mean to say the planes are not flying, the bombs are not dropping, and that people are not being killed. I don't mean that. But, as an American senior military officer said this week, the bombardment of ISIL by the United States Air Force is several orders of magnitude less than the American bombardment of Serbia during the Yugoslav war. So, why are they pretending to be fighting ISIL when actually, really, they're not? Neither are they carrying out their responsibilities to the government in Baghdad whilst they maintain a position of war against the government in Damascus. So who's been effective in fighting them? Well, the most effective by far has been the Syrian Arab Army, which for 3.5 years, in an epic military confrontation in which 100,000 or more foreign invaders have entered their country, joined up with Syrians who had risen up against the rule of Bashar al-Assad, and the Syrian Arab army, which is overwhelmingly Sunni, by the way, has not only stood firm, but is making steady military advances. The Kurdish Peshmerga in Syria around Kobani, well, their fight too has been legendary, although it's still going on, and ISIL haven't given up their efforts to enter and no doubt crucify, behead, and eat the hearts out of every human being they can capture there. The Iraqi army, the most trained army in the world, and the most expensively created army in the world, on which hundreds of billions of dollars have been expended, we're told is some way off being able effectively to fight the ISIL fighters. Shiite militiamen have done a better job than the Iraqi armed forces have done. The Turkish armed forces remain behind the wire watching it all happen. And the Saudi armed forces, pretty well equipped, at least they tell the people that they spent all those billions on Western weapons. I don't actually know if there's any evidence that they did or what happened to the weapons once they bought them. But the Saudi armed forces are involved only in killing their own people, not in challenging the existential threat of ISIL. So, who do you think has been effective in fighting ISIL? The second topic tonight is this. We hear all the time a lot of talk about Muslim extremists. Commentators rarely do, as I am about to do, bother to point out that these Muslim extremists are behaving in a way that's very far from Muslim, certainly not countenanced in any way by the religion of Islam. But they call them Muslim extremists in any case. I'm asking the question tonight, how should Jewish extremists be dealt with? I'm thinking of in the West Bank, where settlers, claiming to be acting, though none of us here believe that, in accordance with their religious obligations, have not just stolen the land of the Palestinians, not just regularly killed them, but have moved into a fairly routine pattern of desecrating and destroying Muslim places of worship. And just this week, they burned down yet another mosque in the West Bank and tore the hijabs of two of the worshippers there while they were praying. Now that's pretty extremist behavior, but you will rarely see it showcased in Western media outlets. Well, it's going to be showcased here tonight. But of course, these Jewish extremists don't just exist in Israel. I could show you my scars. I mean, literally, my scars. I can talk about this now because the man who attacked and assaulted me brutally and lastingly just 3 months ago finally pleaded guilty in court last Friday. He had been due to stand trial on Monday of this week, but he has now changed his plea and is now convicted of assaulting with actual bodily harm a British Member of Parliament for 28 years in broad daylight in a London street in front of anyone who happened to be walking or passing by. Now, this is a very interesting man because he actually is Jewish, but a few months ago he was not Jewish. He converted to Judaism, he says, although his attack on me was very far from the teachings of the Jewish religion. But it was a brutal attack, and he said to the police on tape that he had done it because he was Jewish. Now this poses another additional tangential question. This man who became Jewish has never set foot, so far as I know, in Palestine. None of his ancestors have ever set foot, as far as I know, in Palestine. But Neil Masterson, as a converted Jew, now has the legal right to go and live in Palestine, on the land, even in the house of an actual Palestinian who has been driven from that house and whose ancestors lived there for millennia. Confused? You shouldn't be. I'll explain it all here on comment over the next 50 minutes or so. First caller on the line is Mohammed in London on the subject of ISIL. Mohammed, welcome.
Hi, good evening, George.
Good evening to you.
Good evening, sir. Yeah, basically, with regarding ISIL or ISIS or Daesh or whatever the name they keep finding themselves, it is the same name to an idea, an ideology that's been running in the Middle East, running wild in the Middle East, spreading hate, spreading prosecution, spreading killing for the last, I don't know, maybe a century or so. And now, recently, we're trying to discuss to how we're going to kill this idea. Killing this idea is not going to come by bombing, and you know the bombing in northern Iraq will always lead to a suicide bombing in southern Iraq. So basically, there are a few steps, which is we addressed so many times at the UN, that to kill an idea, you have to drain its sources, drain the funds, stop the hate speech in Saudi Arabia and the countries surrounding these areas. You can sanction those who can fund those groups. The weapons, where do they get the weapons from? Especially, last time we had few mistakes that dropping bombs to ISIL and happened in Kobani and what have you. Where this going to go to? And other steps as well. We have to set more regulations on YouTube or on other social media where those groups are proudly showing the videos of their hanged, the killing and what have you. And people are getting recruited through this area. Here in Britain, universities are recruiting students. I mean, with their own societies, with funding and with raising money and what have you. They're watching this kind of videos, and they are discussing this kind of videos, and they've been kind of mobilized with this kind of videos. So how these videos and how this social media is leading to 700 foreigners are fighting from Europe in Syria. Other point as well is we have to sit down with countries who are supporting by borders. Turkey, for example, Iran is part of it. Saudi Arabia, a serious talk about this, because we're not going to come here in 20 years' time, George, and you've seen this 20 years ago when Iraq was attacked and how many was killed and how many are being victimized. To now, this is an example again of failed policies that we are being a victim of it, and I thank you about this.
Well, Mohammed, I struggled to hear some of that because of the telephone line, but what I did hear of it, it seemed a powerful and cogent argument. I can't deal with every point that you made because I've got to go on to Craig in London, but I want to deal with just two of them. Where they get their weapons is no rocket science. They took many of their weapons from the Iraqi army, which threw them to the ground and ran away. And those weapons are now being used to kill Iraqis and Syrians because, of course, ISIL goes back and forward across the border between these two countries largely with impunity. That's the point I was making about the American bombardment, which is, and I quoted the military officer who said, it was several orders of magnitude below the amount of bombing that was done in Serbia, in Europe, in the Yugoslav war. And so these columns and convoys of ISIL fighters, terrorists, who are moving back and forward between the two countries, clearly, largely uninterrupted. But their previous weapons cache was taken from the so-called free, so-called Syrian, so-called army. And those weapons were given to the FSA by the United States and other Western countries. And non-lethal military aid had been given by us in Britain to them, which was promptly taken from them by ISIL. They've also, of course, been on the receiving end of significant foreign funding through Turkey and funding from Saudi Arabia and, by the way, elsewhere in the Persian Gulf area. So they're not short of money for buying weapons. And, of course, when they conquered parts of Iraq in the summertime, they immediately looted the banks and stole hundreds of millions of dollars. They're also extorting money from people and kidnapping and then selling those people. And when they kill people, they steal their wives and their children, and they sell them too. They even had a price list which they circulated, selling them. So they're a big money-making machine. They're selling stolen Iraqi and Syrian oil. So it's no real mystery where they're getting the wherewithal to carry on their brutal terrorist campaign. Craig is in London on the same subject. Craig, welcome.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
How are you?
Go ahead, sir.
I think in general, to solve all the problems in the Middle East, it cannot be solved through bombing and wars. I think the most effective way to solve all the problems in the Middle East, including the problem of ISIS, is through negotiation. I think the most effective way is that we should bring representatives from the Assad regime, Israeli regime, and even representatives from ISIS and bring them to Geneva, and so they can sort out their problems. I think that would be the most effective way rather than bombing and, bloodshed.
Well, there's no possibility, of course, of ISIL being prepared to negotiate with anyone. They are a terrorist group who have pan-Islamist ambitions. Their ambitions are not restricted to Iraq or Syria or both put together. They have demands. Their demands are that every Muslim in the world should pay bayah, should pledge allegiance to this man called Baghdadi, and that every country in the world should be a Muslim country, even if the only way to achieve that is by the sword. So there's really nothing to negotiate with ISIL about. But the suggestion that you made of negotiations is, of course, vitally important. And there were talks in Geneva, and they were wrecked by the Western-backed Syrian opposition. It's time now for the Western countries who are alarmed, they say, by ISIL to force the Syrian opposition back to Geneva to negotiate an end to the war in Syria, because that's the only way that we're going to begin to put a cap on the horrific violence that we have seen. But something you said, and Mohammed before you said, is true. You cannot kill an idea by bombing and shooting. You cannot. But that doesn't mean you don't bomb and shoot. When people are an existential threat to your existence, you have no alternative but to fight them. And that's what has to happen with ISIL. But you're right. The swamp of hatred out of which mutations like ISIL, like bin Laden, have emerged is the swamp that has to be drained. And what are the three quick and effective ways that we could drain that swamp? First of all, Western countries have to stop bankrolling and arming the terrorist settler state of Israel and instead support its victims, preeminently the Palestinian people, whose country was wiped off the map and their people scattered to the four corners of the earth. The second thing we need to do is to stop invading and occupying and bombing Muslim countries, because that only generates more and more extremism. And the third thing that we have to do is stop propping up dictators in the Arab and Muslim world. Because if we didn't prop them up, they would fall, and they would fall to their own people. Who knows what the outcome would be? You might get a government you don't like, but it would be their government, and therefore it would be a stable government, and a government with which you could do business. The point is, I'm not asking for the West to invade or attack any of these dictatorships. I'm against doing that. I'm not asking us to do anything to bring about these revolutions that are vitally necessary, other than to stop doing what we are doing to prop them up. Stop giving them money, stop giving them weapons, stop giving them diplomatic, political, and media support. Thanks for the call. Baz is in Los Angeles. Wish I was. Baz, go ahead.
Hi, George. Good to see you on the TV again.
Thank you, Baz. Go ahead, brother.
First, let me say something about a comment made by your last caller before I answer the question. The comment about negotiating with ISIS or ISIL or whatever you want to call them. You have as much potential, logically, negotiating with those people as you do negotiating with the hornet's nest on your doorstep.
Yeah.
They're neither human beings nor are they able to communicate in any kind of human language. Let's just end it at that. Now, about your question, who's been successful fighting ISIS, ISIL? Well, to answer that, let's ask, what's the definition of success in war? It's to take territory from your enemy, isn't it? Well, since this turnaround in Syria, since the government of Bashar Assad has been taking some of the territory back, it's clear he hasn't been doing it by himself. He's had help. And that help has been coming almost exclusively from Iran and Hezbollah.
Russia's helped a little bit too, Baz.
That's true. Russia's been giving some materials, but not nearly to the degree that Iran has been giving manpower, materials, money, and fuel, everything else. So yeah, Russia has also been there.
If it wasn't for Russia's veto on the Security Council, things would be very different. But anyway, go on.
Absolutely. I was just about to say on the political side as well. So you're absolutely right about that. But on the ground, George, in terms of taking territory away without Hezbollah and Iranian support, God knows what would be the state of the Middle East right now. God knows what would be happening in Lebanon, if it would be just as bad as what's happening in Iraq and Syria. So, the Americans say now that they're fighting in ISIS, but like you said earlier, that's all rubbish. I mean, it's all just a scam.
It's window dressing, really, Baz.
What's that, George?
It's window dressing. I mean, this is not a serious military challenge to ISIL that the United States is putting up.
No, it's not, but it's a cover so they can bomb Syrian assets. I mean, the day after they announced that they were going to start bombing ISIL, they were bombing Syrian oil facilities and airfields.
I think it's a cover for this, Baz, so that they can say the bombing isn't working, we'll have to invade. We'll have to send ground forces. That's what I think.
That's part of it, George. I think they're trying to starve the Syrian people into taking up arms against the Syrian government. Without the oil, becomes even more impoverished, and the people obviously will become more aggressive against any kind of authority. And it's not necessarily a pro for ISIL, but it's definitely more of an anti-Assad move, and I think that's part of their plan.
Baz, thanks for that. Great call, and good to hear you in Los Angeles, and a big up to all our American viewers. I know there are very many of those, despite the government's refusal to allow us to broadcast properly through people's television stations, sets there as elsewhere, including here. Now, the questions are Jewish extremism in Palestine and in West London, and ISIL. Who has been effective in fighting them? I have to go for 3 short minutes for a short news bulletin. God willing, I'll still be here when you get back. So call me, text me, email me, tweet me. But above all, don't go away. I'll be right back after a very short 3-minute news bulletin. Until then. Welcome back to Comment with me, George Galloway, here on Press TV. Still the voice of the voiceless, giving voice to the otherwise voiceless by phone, but by text and email and even tweet also. We're asking tonight who has been effective in fighting ISIL. Certainly not the United States Air Force, it would appear, because ISIL are murdering and desecrating and beheading and crucifying just as they always were. And an American military official concedes that the amount of bombing that the US Air Force is doing against ISIL in Iraq and Syria is orders of magnitude less than the effort against the Serbian and Yugoslavian forces way back when. How about Jewish extremism? This phenomenon, which of course we're all familiar with, or should be, in occupied Palestine, is spreading in different parts of the world. A rabbi in Manchester had his car torched, burned out by extremists, angry at his stand in support of the Palestinian people. A rabbi, no less. I, a British Member of Parliament for almost 30 years, was savagely assaulted in a London street. But they didn't call it terrorism. They would have, of course, if I had been a Jewish Member of Parliament and a Muslim extremist had attacked and mercilessly beaten me. Here's Jay in London on that very subject. Jay, welcome.
Good evening, George. It's very nice to see you again, and thank you for being here, and you're still strong. Fantastic to see you. Thank you, sir. I want to talk about Israel and ISIS. The fact that they have similarities in the alphabets, both start with I and S. Yeah. These two, neither of them are representative of the religions that they're claiming to represent. ISIS does not represent Islam, and in Islam there is no, what they're doing, which is killing, hate, war, slaying the victims, and all in the name of religion. Israel is doing the same thing. I don't call Israel a Jewish state. I call Israel an anti-Jewish state. Israel is a Zionist state. ISIS is not a representative of Islam. They are anti-Islamic. I would call them both anti-Jews and anti-Islam. I wouldn't call them Jewish extremism, because Jewish extremism doesn't exist. Jews are Jews. Muslims are Muslims. Those people who start using these religions for their own purposes, they're nothing to do with Islam. They're nothing to do with Judaism. They're just representing an ideology, and they're trying to pretend and jump on the bandwagon of calling themselves Muslims or Jews. Same as these Mujahideen calling themselves Mujahideen of Iran. Nothing to do with Iran. They even had a charity called Iran Aid that raised £75 million that eventually was closed down by FBI and also by the Charity Commission in Britain. It had nothing to do with Iran. It was just using the name of Iran in order to latch on this idea that it is for the orphan children of Iran. These people are just after their own purposes, after their own ideologies, and I wouldn't call Jews extremism. I wouldn't call ISIS Muslims. They're just anti-Jews, anti-Islam, and they're anti-religion.
Great call, Jay. Absolutely powerful and eloquent as usual. Thanks for it. Mario is in Malta on the same subject. Mario, welcome.
Welcome. Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir. Go ahead.
I'm going to say about Palestine and Israel, and Palestinian is like an apartheid, same as Africa. See, because long time ago I was the same when I was in Africa. The African people were slaves in their own country. The same thing is Palestine. Netanyahu, he's a terrorist. He's a terrorist. But why? He tests the world power, Israel. Is a fifth world power. Killing those. Why? Because, even the ISIS, some of them, the majority, I think they are from Saudi Arabia, because they capture the heads in Saudi, you know what I mean?
Well, Saudi Arabia emptied its prisons of people who had been convicted to long-term in prison or even death. They saved people from being beheaded by sending them to Syria to behead other people, falsely in the name of Islam, as Jay in London pointed out just a minute ago. Mario, great call Thanks for it. We're getting around the world today. So where else would we go but Leicester? Yasmin, who has been effective in fighting ISIL in your view?
Evening, George.
Good evening to you. Welcome.
Well, to answer the question on one level, nobody seems to be fighting and getting out the truth to fight the lies of ISIS and about what ISIS actually is. In fact, you're the only person I've heard in authority on the box that's, that's actually said anything. Nobody else seems to be. If they are saying it, the general public aren't hearing it. So what I want to say to you is, what do you suggest that the ordinary geezer can do to support people like you who are trying to get the truth out about what ISIS actually is?
Well, Yasmin, thanks for that. You can encourage people, of course, to watch the show, to go onto YouTube. I've got more than 50,000 videos on YouTube. Not all of them sympathetic, of course, but it's a lot. And more than 100 million people have watched them. That's a pretty big audience. We need to make it bigger. You can follow me on Twitter at George Galloway, or on Facebook, George Galloway MP. You can tell people about the analysis which we're giving here at Press TV, and I'm trying to do across all the platforms on which I'm working. We have to struggle amongst the Muslims here in Britain to pull them back from the siren voices who are trying to lure them onto the rocks of extremism, separatism, violence, and even self-immolation. 500 British Muslims are fighting alongside ISIL, although some are with the official al-Qaeda group, Jabhat al-Nusra, in Syria, a group which expelled ISIL as being too extreme. They were too extreme for al-Qaeda. We have to make sure that 500 doesn't get bigger, and that some of those who have gone there are facilitated in coming back. I agree with those who say that some of these young people were fooled into going there, did not know what it was they were really joining, and we shouldn't make them afraid to come home. Of course, when they do come home, they're going to be closely watched, and that's also inevitable. Yasmin, great call. I'm pressing on only because there are so many callers. Bahrouz in London on the same subject. Bahrouz, welcome. Bahrouz.
Oh, yes. Hello, George. Hi. Sorry, just a momentarily delay there. I'd just like to say, just regarding the ISIS situation at the moment and who's been most effective fighting them, I personally don't think anybody's been terribly effective in this particular situation. I think it's a situation that the West and Israel have devised very much as part of their divide and conquer strategy, part of the balkanization process of Iraq and the Middle East in general. I think there was a Senate Select Committee hearing a few years ago that found out some of these private military contractors were actually arming the resistance fighters in Iraq, and I think that this is very much playing on from that, which is very much long-term strategy to balkanize the region. I think it goes back to the 80s. It was Obed Yenin who was an advisor to the Israeli government. He helped devise the overall method of the overall plan to try and balkanize member states that were seen as a threat to Israel and America's dominance in the region. And I think that's also been influenced by Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, has also been picked up by Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, who's, of course, one of Obama's main handlers. And I was just wondering your personal thoughts on that.
Well, it's a very good call. You're a very erudite fellow. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I'm just looking at the screen here. The Kurdish people are, the Kurdish fighters are fighting a magnificent fight and are beginning to have some successes, turning back ISIL offensives and even liberating territory like that Christian village that we've just seen on the screen. You're right that Brzezinski's support for these kind of groups back in the 1980s on the immoral principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend in Afghanistan is what has led to all of this. These were the first steps taken by Western countries, principally the United States, but also Britain, in creating what has become a Frankenstein monster. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, did I say that correctly? Forgive me if I didn't, but Brzezinski, the former Secretary of State of Jimmy Carter, has a lot of the responsibility for the situation we are now in. But many others share that responsibility. And I'm sorry to say this. Principally amongst them is the state that calls itself Saudi Arabia. Not the people of Saudi Arabia, but the regime which robs the people of Saudi Arabia. I'm going to Denmark next, to Francesco in Denmark on ISIL. Go ahead, Francesco.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening to you, sir.
I think the Kurdish Peshmerga are doing good job.
They are.
Fighting ISIS. But we don't forget that many Syrian soldiers lost their life protecting their country.
Yes. It's a very important point. I should have made it earlier to our friend in Los Angeles. Of course, Iran has been helping Syria, and of course, Hezbollah has also shouldered some important battles and has been an important ally. But the vast majority of the fighting is being done by Syrians defending their country. Sunni and Shia, Christian and Muslim, defending their country against those who wish to tear it apart. And neither Iran nor Hezbollah would want us to lose sight of that fundamental truth. Go on, Francesco.
You're right, sir. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're getting around the world. We're going to Geneva next, to Mehdad in Geneva. Go ahead, sir. Yes, go on, sir.
God bless you and all of your colleagues. I wish really we should have some more people like you and be established also in Geneva, Switzerland. We have this United Nations.
Yes.
So most probably we could use this place and make a worldwide petition regarding this criminal country which they call themselves Israel. So someday we can really try to influence, change this policy that they say, we do what we want, you do what we say. You know, as long as we have this state of criminal in the planet Earth, you know, we should not be surprised to have ISIL and all these criminals going to Syria and Iraq. You know, we shouldn't be surprised. We have to stop this in a way effective, because it's not going to work so far. You know, we don't have no efficiency. They do what they want. Last week or a week ago, 10 days ago, we had seminar of international human rights. Of course, we had everyone here. They talk about this lady who was in Iran, who was prosecuted after 7 years of judgment, and they accuse Iran because of the fact that Iran is not taking care of the human rights. Now, we don't want to go to Gaza and go to occupied territory and find thousands and thousands of families who they should have a file open and active against the state of Israel. So one day the banks and some of the rulers who they have direct influence of Tel Aviv and Israel to stop ruling the world, because it's outrageous today what's happening.
Thanks for that call, Mehdad. The Geneva ought to be the place where the United Nations is itself situated. The fact that it's in New York and the United States abuses the position of the United Nations being there is something that we have avoided for too long. But that doesn't mean that the United Nations proceedings in Geneva can be less than farcical, because they are, at the moment, utterly farcical. The attacks on Iran, by the way, I'm against the death penalty anywhere in any country for any reason, but the attacks on Iran over human rights at the United Nations in Geneva were farcical, because of course they ignored the beam in the eye of the accusers and focused entirely on the mote in the eye of the accused. Mehdad, thanks for the call. We're going to Africa, to Nigeria, to Ogashuwa in Nigeria. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. Good day, sir.
Good day to you. Go ahead.
Okay, sir. The only way to eradicate the Jewish extremism is very simple. Point number one, Saudi Arabia should withdraw from Israel. Point number two, the America and Britain should refuse withdraw supply arms to the extremists, Israelis, Jewish. And the third, the Egypt should boycott cooperation with them. All these things, the Jewish terrorists, they are more than America, they are more than Ebola. And these are present dispensation.
Well, we reject the nomenclature, of course. They call themselves a Jewish state, but we say they are not. Not just because they act in the opposite way to what a Jewish state would act, a real Jewish state, but because and not just because many of the people who live in the state are not Jewish, but also because Jewish people all around the world, and we had one of them on the show tonight, Jay in London, utterly reject their pretensions to be a Jewish state. Bill is in Leeds. Let's ask him what he thinks. Bill, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say that the Temple Mount is Judaism's holiest site. And this is where the temples, the two temples were built previously, and God willing, the third temple will be built. Now, if you're going to define extremism, yeah, if a Jew is going to pray on his holiest site, I'm sorry to tell you, if that's called provocative, then so be it. If that instigates problems, then so be it. This is Judaism's holiest site, and this is where Jews will come and pray whenever they want and how they want. And if Muslims held this site with a modicum of respect, then they wouldn't be playing football on this site, and they wouldn't be keeping it as a place to store their stones. Let me just tell you something.
Their stones.
What is extremism is brandishing kitchen knives around Israel against young women and children, instigating car attacks, running over young children in car attacks all over Israel. That is called extremism. In a country, what they call occupation doesn't apply because simply it was no sovereign country beforehand. And I can tell you one thing, that if the mad mullahs in Iran decide to ever dare start with Israel, I can tell you one thing, the Gaza Strip will look like a five-star hotel in comparison to Tehran.
Well, I think you've given us a pretty good example of Jewish extremism. I think the hysteria of your mendacity, the violence of your language, and your exhortation to create problems. So be it, you said. If this causes problems, so be it. That is priceless, Bill. You have just done, in the last few minutes, more for my cause in support of the Palestinian people, my case that Israel is not a Jewish state, it's a lunatic state. It's a deranged lunatic state with nuclear weapons and evil intentions. You have just been the perfect advertisement for my case, and I'm grateful that you called us, even though you've hung up and run away. Fahim is in Tehran. Let's hear from him. We've lost
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Thank you very much. Actually, it's been a long time I haven't talked to you.
Welcome. Go ahead. You're on the air now.
Thank you very much. Obviously, in order to answer your question, I should say that I suppose that the army, the Iraqi army, or let's say the Iraqi people, have been really, effective in fighting against terrorism in their own country, even more than the United States and its coalition that obviously this country has made. It is clear that the war against ISIL is hardly an encompassing war against terror. It is rather largely a war to determine the newly forming geopolitical and obviously geostrategic spaces in Lebanon, in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. I mean, the war which is imposed by the American forces, obviously. If this were not the case, it would be difficult to comprehend what a U.S.-led war is not made much progress, obviously. In this regard, perhaps it would be useful to consider, the geopolitical and geostrategic objectives of the major countries and non-state actors involved in the war. If one takes the contributions to the war effort in terms of aircraft, weapons, funds, and fighters, obviously it is clear that the major contributors are the U.S. and Persian Gulf countries. Except Iran, of course. The geostrategic objectives of the U.S. is to maintain, as you know, as much stability as possible among the sovereign states of the Middle East, particular Iraq, Syria.
Creative chaos, they called it. They wanted to turn the Middle East into a crucible, hoping that in the fire something for them would emerge. Fahim, thanks for that. Clever man in Tehran. Let's go to Shahid in London. Shahid, welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, George.
Walaikum salam. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I would just want to say about Israel, the situation at the moment, well, it's not just at the moment, it's been happening for a long time now, and we're all getting fed up with it. With the same story that Israel always says, tries to make out that Israel is some sort of, innocent puppy surrounded by crazy Arabs. Israel is actually a gangster state. And
there's the evidence there on the screen, Shahid. That's what the rabid dogs of Zionist settlement have done in mosques to worshippers. That's on the screen, the reality of the Zionist state that they call Israel. And Bill, their big supporter from Leeds, threatening Iran, threatening the Palestinians, insulting the faithful on the Haram al-Sharif at the Al-Aqsa, the ignorant extremism that we just heard from Bill in Leeds, sums it up, doesn't it?
That's right. These people, if you listen to the tone of their voice, they're always on the defensive. Because why? Because deep down, they know that Israel is actually a terrorist state. And you know what, George? Actually, you know what? It's about time the whole world is getting fed up. We have to all rise up. We have to.
Well, I think we're well on the way to that, Shahid, and that's why Israel's supporters are getting more and more violent. Violent verbally, like Bill in Leeds. Violent physically, like their big supporter who attacked me. He's locked up and will be for some time.
Hello, just comment the name and the place you left that number. And just make sure that your television volume's set to 0. So 003. Spell your name for me? Yeah, I know. You redirectly put through the phone number and then we'll call you back. Comment. And then